Welcome to History in Ashes, a place where we talk about history not as legend or spectacle, but as something built quietly by ordinary people, routines, and decisions that did not feel important at the time. It is still dark when the knocking begins, heavy, organized, patient. Not the sound of a mob, but of men who know exactly where they are going. Torches flicker against stone walls that have heard prayers every morning for decades. Doors open, names are read, brothers are told to dress. There is no shouting, no resistance. These men have taken vows of obedience, and obedience does not disappear simply because the order comes from the wrong mouth. By sunrise, chains scrape against cobblestone streets. Horses move without banners. A religious order that once stood at the heart of Christendom is being dismantled in silence. This is the moment most people remember. The fall, the arrests, the sudden accusation that the Knights Templar, sworn defenders of pilgrims and guardians of sacred roads, were heretics, idol worshippers, and corrupters of faith. But standing in that cold dawn, watching armed guards escort men who had spent their lives sleeping on straw and eating in silence, the question lingers quietly in the air. How did it come to this point? Before the trials, before the rumors, before kings whispered behind closed doors, there was something far more ordinary. There was routine. There was discipline. There were inventories of grain and lists of horses and schedules for prayer that never changed. The story of the Knights Templar is not built on secrets first. It is built on structure. The order that would one day frighten monarchs began with fewer than a dozen men and almost nothing else. No wealth, no estates, no influence. What they had instead was time and repetition. They stood watch on roads where pilgrims were robbed or killed. They memorized rules governing silence, meals, sleep, and obedience. They accepted boredom as a spiritual discipline. While nobles chased glory, these men learned how to maintain armor, care for horses, and endure hunger without complaint. They were not powerful because they wanted to be. They became powerful because they were reliable. Within a few decades, donations began arriving not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet transfers of land, mills, and farms. A field here, a vineyard there, a barn that could store grain through winter. Each gift required records, caretakers, and planning. The order learned how to manage assets long before it learned how to command armies. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it is where myth gives way to administration. The Knights Templar did not conquer Europe. They organized it. They created systems that allowed wealth to move safely across borders. Pilgrims deposited money in one place and withdrew it in another, using written documents verified by the order. These early financial tools did not feel revolutionary at the time. They felt practical. They prevented theft. They reduced risk. They required trust. That trust, built slowly through decades of consistency, became their greatest asset. And that is when attention shifted. But before we go any further, let me pause here for just a moment. If you are listening right now, tucked into a quiet room or drifting towards sleep, we would love to know where this story is finding you. If you feel like it, scroll down to the comments and tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there. History travels far more easily than the people who lived it ever could. What made the Templars dangerous was not secrecy, but patience. Kings borrowed from them. Nobles entrusted estates to them. The church relied on them to move resources where they were needed most. Over time, they became woven into daily life so thoroughly that removing them would cause disruption. That kind of presence breeds resentment. The French crown, in particular, was drowning in debt. War, luxury, and poor harvests had drained royal coffers. The Templars were not just wealthy, they were organized. Their records were precise. Their ledgers remembered what kings preferred to forget. When obligation meets desperation, accusation is never far behind. The charges that would eventually destroy the order did not appear suddenly. They circulated quietly first, questions raised during audits, suspicion masked as concern for doctrine, rumors that could not be proven but could not be dismissed either. And in a world where faith and politics shared the same breathing space, ambiguity was enough. The arrests that morning were not chaotic because they had been planned with care. Lists prepared, locations mapped, orders sealed. The efficiency that had once defined the Templars was now turned against them. This is one of history's recurring ironies. Systems built for stability are often most vulnerable to centralized power. In prison cells, stripped of routine and structure, many brothers broke. Some confessed to things they did not understand. Some remained silent. Some simply endured, waiting for an authority they had trusted all their lives to intervene. It rarely did. The papacy hesitated. Kings did not. Property was seized. Estates reassigned. The order was dissolved, not by battlefield defeat, but by legal declaration. The slow machinery of administration finished what swords never could. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no single ending. Some former Templars joined other orders. Some returned to farming life. Some disappeared into anonymity, carrying skills that would quietly shape future institutions. The methods remained even as the name vanished. The collapse of the Knights Templar reminds us that history often turns not on passion or belief, but on logistics, debt, and record-keeping. Their rise was built on mundane discipline. Their fall was executed with the same attention to detail. And so the unresolved thought lingers as the torches fade and the chains fall silent. Was the destruction of the order inevitable once it became indispensable, or could a system built on obedience ever survive the moment authority turned against it? Jerusalem, newly captured and barely settled, did not feel like a holy triumph to those who lived there. It felt raw, provisional, and tense. Streets were crowded with people who did not trust one another, languages overlapping without understanding, and faith expressed more through fear than certainty. Pilgrims arrived, expecting safety, and found danger instead. Outside the city walls, narrow roads wound through rocky hills where ambush was easy and mercy rare. This was the environment in which the earliest form of the order emerged, not as a grand vision, but as a practical response to a problem no one else wanted to solve. A small group of knights approached the King of Jerusalem with a proposal that sounded unimpressive, even by the standards of the time. They would live as monks, but fight as soldiers. They would own nothing individually. They would protect pilgrims, not conquer territory. They asked for no pay, only permission. Their numbers were so few that chroniclers barely recorded their names. What mattered more was their willingness to stand watch where others would not. Daily life in those early years was repetitive and restrained. The brothers rose before dawn for prayer, ate simple meals in silence, and spent long hours maintaining equipment that wore down faster than it could be replaced. Armor cracked, horses fell ill, supplies ran thin. There were no ceremonies marking success because success was defined as nothing happening at all. No ambush, no deaths on the road that day. Survival measured quietly. Their living quarters were sparse, often shared with other religious communities. Beds were wooden, blankets were thin. Rules governed everything from how long a man could speak to how he mounted a horse. Obedience was not symbolic. It was enforced because discipline reduced risk. A distracted guard was a dead pilgrim. What set these men apart was not bravery, but consistency. They showed up every day. They learned the terrain. They memorized patterns of movement. They noticed which paths were safest at certain hours. This kind of knowledge did not inspire songs, but it saved lives. Slowly, word spread among pilgrims that certain routes were safer if marked by the presence of these silent riders. The church noticed not because of miracles, but because of reports. Fewer complaints, fewer requests for intervention. Stability, even in small amounts, drew attention. Papal approval followed, not immediately, but after observation. With approval came legitimacy, and with legitimacy came donations. Not extravagant gifts at first, but modest ones. A parcel of land, a small farm, a right to collect grain. Each gift added responsibility. Managing these holdings required skills that had nothing to do with combat. Records had to be kept. Harvests had to be stored. Tenants had to be supervised. Brothers who had once stood watch on dusty roads now found themselves counting sacks of wheat and repairing fences. This was not a deviation from their mission, it was an extension of it. Stability in the rear made safety on the road possible. As their responsibilities grew, so did their internal structure. Ranks were clarified, duties assigned. The order developed a rhythm that could be replicated anywhere. A new house established in Europe followed the same pattern as one in the Levant. Prayer at the same hours, meals prepared the same way, accounts kept in familiar formats. This uniformity allowed the order to expand without chaos. The men themselves came from varied backgrounds. Some were minor nobles with little inheritance. Others were experienced soldiers tired of shifting allegiances. A few were younger sons seeking purpose rather than property. What they shared was an acceptance of anonymity. Individual glory was discouraged. Even acts of courage were attributed to obedience rather than personal merit. This suppression of individuality had consequences. It made the order resilient. A brother could die and be replaced without disruption. Knowledge was communal. Responsibility was collective. The institution mattered more than the man. This is often where modern audiences lose interest, because it sounds dull. But history turns on exactly this kind of dullness. While kingdoms rose and fell through dramatic gestures, the Knights Templar advanced through repetition. They refined procedures for movement, supply, and communication. Messages were carried in predictable intervals. Horses were rotated to prevent exhaustion. Equipment was standardized. These details, recorded in rules and enforced without exception, created reliability. Reliability attracts trust. Trust attracts resources. Resources attract scrutiny. By the time the order was formally recognized across Europe, it was already functioning as a network. Houses in distant regions shared information and supported one another. A shortage in one area could be mitigated by surplus in another. This was not charity. It was logistics. The irony is that the very qualities that allowed the Templars to survive in a hostile landscape also made them difficult to control. They answered to the papacy directly, bypassing local authorities. They moved resources without paying local taxes. They maintained internal courts. These privileges were granted because they seemed necessary at the time. Few considered what would happen once necessity faded. Yet in these early years, the focus remained narrow. Protect the roads, maintain discipline, endure discomfort. The brothers did not imagine the scale their order would reach. They were too busy surviving the present. At night, after prayers, silence returned. Men lay awake listening to the sounds of animals outside the walls, the distant murmur of a city still uneasy under new rule. They could not know that their routines were laying the foundation for something far larger than themselves. They could not know that centuries later, their quiet methods would be cited as reasons for their destruction. And so the question lingers gently at the edge of this beginning. When an institution grows not through ambition but through reliability, does it ever realize when it has become something others will fear? As the order's presence settled into the routines of Jerusalem, its influence began to spread outward, carried not by conquest, but by imitation. What worked on one dangerous road could work on another. What kept discipline in a small house could be scaled to a larger one. Across Europe, nobles who had never set foot in the Levant began to view the Knights Templar less as distant warriors and more as dependable custodians. The land they were given was rarely glamorous. It was often marginal soil, half-ruined buildings, or estates burdened with obligations. Accepting these gifts meant accepting responsibility. A farm needed oversight year after year. A mill required maintenance. Tenants expected fairness and protection. The order did not delegate these tasks to outsiders. Brothers were assigned, rotated, trained, and monitored. They learned how many animals a pasture could support without exhaustion. They learned how long grain could be stored before spoilage. These were not heroic skills, but they kept people fed. In an age where famine was never far away, predictability mattered. The Templars became known for it. They enforced contracts consistently, even when enforcement was inconvenient. They refused certain donations if conditions threatened their autonomy. This restraint puzzled contemporaries. Most institutions grasped for immediate gain. The order thought in longer intervals. Letters and records multiplied. Lists of holdings stretched across regions. Messengers traveled familiar routes carrying information rather than commands. Over time, these records allowed the order to see patterns others missed. They knew which harvests had failed, which roads had grown unsafe, which regions could absorb more pilgrims without strain. Knowledge accumulated quietly. Pilgrims noticed the difference. A journey that once required carrying coins sewn into clothing could now be managed through documents recognized across distant houses. This reduced theft. It reduced violence. It also reduced the need for local intermediaries, which subtly shifted power. Trust moved away from local lords and toward an institution that did not belong to any single kingdom. This was not perceived as a threat at first. It was perceived as convenience. Within the order, daily life remained constrained. Brothers still rose before dawn. Meals remained plain. Conversation was regulated. Even as wealth passed through their hands, personal poverty was enforced. Shoes were repaired until unusable. Cloaks were patched. Comfort was discouraged because it softened discipline. Outsiders sometimes misinterpreted this as hypocrisy, unable to distinguish between institutional wealth and personal deprivation. The distinction mattered deeply to the men living it. They did not feel rich. They felt busy. As houses multiplied, so did responsibilities. Some brothers spent entire lives without seeing battle. They managed storehouses, oversaw construction, or trained new recruits in rules that never changed. This continuity created stability, but also isolation. The order became a world unto itself, bound by internal logic and ritual. The church continued to grant privileges, often in response to immediate needs. Exemptions from local authority simplified coordination. Direct papal oversight prevented interference. Each privilege made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a shield. That shield protected the order from corruption, but also from accountability. Kings watched this development with mixed feelings. They admired the efficiency. They borrowed money. They entrusted valuables. Yet they also noticed that the order's loyalty did not bend toward crowns. Allegiance was vertical, not horizontal. It ran upward to Rome, not outward to kingdoms. This distinction would matter later. For now, cooperation prevailed. The order provided logistical support during military campaigns. They transported supplies. They maintained roads. They acted as intermediaries. Their presence reduced uncertainty. Where uncertainty vanished, planning became possible. But planning exposes imbalances. Some rulers began to realize that they depended on systems they did not control. Debts accumulated not through extravagance alone, but through reliance. When harvests failed or wars dragged on, obligations became visible. Inside the order, few discussed politics. The rules discouraged speculation about external affairs. Brothers were taught to focus on assigned duties. This inward focus preserved unity but limited awareness. They did not see resentment forming because it formed elsewhere, in courts and councils, where their absence was noted. At the same time, the crusading project itself was faltering. Territories once secured required constant reinforcement. Public enthusiasm waned. Donations slowed. The original justification for the order began to blur. They adapted by leaning further into administration, becoming even more indispensable in Europe while their purpose in the East grew uncertain. This imbalance planted quiet doubts. What was the order now, if the roads it once guarded no longer held the same meaning? Institutions often survive their original mission, but survival demands explanation. The Templars did not offer one publicly. They simply continued. Silence can be misread. As years passed, the Order's archives grew thick with parchment. Decisions were documented, assets tracked, obligations recorded. This memory gave them strength, but it also made them legible. Anyone who gained access to these records could see the full extent of their reach, and reach invites evaluation. The brothers continued their routines, unaware that elsewhere their reliability was being reinterpreted as rigidity, their autonomy as defiance, their silence as secrecy. History often shifts not when people change their behavior, but when others change how that behavior is perceived. So, as the order settled deeper into the fabric of Europe, a quiet question began to form, rarely spoken aloud but increasingly felt. When an institution becomes too essential to ignore, who decides whether it is still allowed to exist? By the time the order reached what might be called its middle age, it no longer thought of itself as new or provisional. The rules had hardened into tradition. The routines were no longer tested, only repeated. A brother entering the order now stepped into a structure that expected him to disappear into it. His name mattered less than his function. His survival depended on learning how things were done and doing them the same way every day. This was also the period when the Knights Templar quietly reshaped how people interacted with distance. Europe was fragmented, slow, and suspicious. Borders were porous, but authority was not. Moving wealth across regions meant exposing it to theft, tolls, and arbitrary seizure. The Order solved this problem not through force, but through paperwork. A pilgrim could deposit money at one house and receive a document that could be redeemed at another. The paper itself was worthless. The system behind it was not. What made this possible was consistency. Each house recognized the marks and language used by the others. Records were cross-checked. Errors were corrected quietly. Fraud was punished internally. This reduced the need for public enforcement and prevented disputes from escalating. Over time, people trusted the process, not because it was exciting, but because it worked. Inside the houses, the work supporting this system was tedious. Accounts were reviewed repeatedly. Ledgers were updated by hand. Mistakes meant shortages that could ripple outward. Brothers responsible for finances were trained to be cautious rather than clever. Innovation was discouraged unless necessity demanded it. Stability was valued above speed. The men performing this labor were not separate from the religious life of the order. Prayer framed the work. Silence accompanied it. Financial management was treated as another form of discipline, no different from fasting or night watches. This fusion of sacred and administrative duty confused outsiders. It did not look like devotion, it looked like control. Meanwhile, the order's military role continued, though it was increasingly overshadowed by its logistical importance. Campaigns depended on supply lines more than courage. Horses needed feed. Weapons needed maintenance. Men needed rest. The Templars provided infrastructure that made movement possible. Their forts were placed not just for defense, but for coordination. Losses mounted in the east. Cities once held fell back into contested hands. Each loss reduced the visible purpose of the order, while increasing the importance of its supporting role. This inversion was subtle but significant. The Templars were becoming essential without being inspiring. In Europe, their estates functioned like small, regulated communities. Tenants lived under predictable rules, rents were standardized, disputes were handled internally when possible. This predictability made Templar lands attractive during unstable periods. People preferred boring governance to uncertain freedom. Yet predictability also drew attention from rulers struggling to maintain control. When neighboring lands suffered mismanagement or corruption, the contrast was uncomfortable. It raised questions about competence and authority. Why did an order answerable to Rome manage resources better than local officials answerable to a crown? Debts accumulated quietly. Kings borrowed not because they were reckless, but because the order was available. Loans were recorded. Repayment schedules existed. Unlike other lenders, the Templars did not forgive easily, but they were patient. Patience can feel like pressure. The brothers administering these arrangements rarely interacted with royalty directly. Communication passed through formal channels. Requests were documented. Responses delayed until reviewed. This slowness was intentional. It prevented rash decisions. It also frustrated those accustomed to immediate deference. Within the order, this period felt stable. There were no major reforms, no internal revolts. Recruitment continued at a steady pace. Older brothers trained younger ones. Knowledge passed downward through repetition rather than instruction manuals. What had once been adaptive became habitual. Habit is comforting to those inside an institution. It is alarming to those outside who feel excluded by it. Rumors began to circulate not because of evidence, but because of distance. The order did not explain itself publicly. It had never needed to. Its authority rested on papal support and demonstrated competence. As long as those remained intact, questions could be ignored. But the political landscape was changing. Monarchies were centralizing. Bureaucracies expanded. Kings wanted systems they could command, not merely rely on. The existence of a powerful, autonomous network within their territories became increasingly inconvenient. None of this was discussed in the order's houses. Brothers continued to wake before dawn. They continued to inspect horses, count stores, and copy records. They believed that adherence to rule equaled protection. Historically, this belief has often been justified. Just as often, it has failed. The gap between perception and reality widened. To the brothers, they were serving stability. To some rulers, they were hoarding influence. To the church, they were useful, but increasingly difficult to defend without cost. Still, nothing happened suddenly. Years passed. Men aged. Estates expanded incrementally. The order persisted, largely unchanged, as if endurance itself were proof of legitimacy. History rarely announces when conditions have shifted beyond repair. It moves quietly, allowing institutions to continue as they always have, until continuation becomes the very reason they are targeted. And so the unresolved thought settles gently here. When an institution survives by refusing to change, how does it recognize the moment when the world around it already has? If you have been listening this far and have not subscribed yet, this is a quiet reminder. Orders like the Knights Templar vanished when support disappeared and attention drifted elsewhere. Channels like History and Ashes are no different. Without your support, we stop making these stories, and this place slowly goes silent. Now, let us continue. By the time the cracks began to show, the world around the Knights Templar was already changing in ways they could not control. The great crusading momentum that had once justified their existence was weakening. Cities in the east were harder to hold. Supply lines stretched thin. Armies arrived late, underfunded, and poorly coordinated. The idea of permanent Christian dominance in the region faded not through a single defeat, but through exhaustion. For the Order, this created an uncomfortable imbalance. Their military role was still real, but it no longer defined them. Their forts became logistical hubs rather than launching points. Their brothers spent more time coordinating movement than fighting. Success now meant managing retreat as carefully as advance. These are not stories that inspire donations. In Europe, however, their administrative presence grew stronger. As crusading enthusiasm declined, land and wealth shifted back westward. Estates expanded. Responsibilities multiplied. The Order adapted by doing what it always did, maintaining routines. Grain was stored, accounts balanced, horses bred and rotated. The discipline that once protected pilgrims now protected continuity. This was survival through normalization. Daily life within a Templar house at this stage was almost entirely predictable. Brothers rose, prayed, worked, ate, and slept on fixed schedules. The work itself varied little from season to season. Inspect fences, oversee harvests, review inventories, train younger brothers. Nothing about it felt like impending collapse. Yet beyond the walls, political pressure was building. Kings were no longer content to rule loosely connected territories. They wanted centralized authority, standardized taxation, and direct oversight. Institutions that existed outside royal control were tolerated only if they were weak or temporary. The Knights Templar were neither. The French crown, in particular, was under strain. War, administrative expansion, and failed harvests had drained resources. The king needed money and control, and he needed both quickly. The Order represented a concentration of both that did not answer to him. This tension did not begin with violence. It began with paperwork. Audits were requested, records examined, legal privileges questioned. Each inquiry was framed as routine. The Order complied calmly. Their records were thorough, their processes transparent within their own framework. But transparency to oneself does not equal transparency to others. Outsiders did not always understand what they saw. The brothers managing these exchanges were trained to be cautious, not conciliatory. Requests were reviewed slowly. Answers were precise but limited. This was normal behavior within the Order. To royal officials, it felt obstructive. Suspicion grows most easily when communication styles differ. At the same time, whispers began to circulate about practices within the Order. Some were misunderstandings, some were distortions of internal rituals never intended for public explanation. Silence, once a sign of discipline, became a blank canvas for rumor. The Church found itself in a difficult position. The Order remained useful. Its resources supported broader ecclesiastical needs. but defending it required political capital that was increasingly expensive. As pressure mounted, support softened. Inside the houses, brothers continued their lives unchanged. They were trained not to speculate. They believed that obedience and rule were shields. They had weathered criticism before. They expected this to pass. History is unkind to institutions that mistake endurance for immunity. When arrests finally came, they came everywhere at once. Not as reaction, but as execution of a plan prepared long in advance. Brothers were taken from familiar routines and placed into isolation. The sudden removal of structure was as damaging as the accusations themselves. In confinement, daily discipline vanished. Prayer schedules were disrupted. Silence was replaced with interrogation. Men who had defined themselves by obedience were confronted with demands that contradicted everything they had been taught. Confessions emerged under pressure. Some were vague, some were contradictory. Many reflected confusion rather than belief. Yet once recorded, they took on lives of their own. Words extracted in isolation were repeated as evidence in public. The order's centralized structure, once a strength, now worked against it. Decisions were made far from individual brothers. Local defenses were irrelevant. There was no flexibility built into the system for dissent or adaptation. The rules had never anticipated this scenario. What followed was administrative dismantling rather than dramatic destruction. Properties were reassigned, records redistributed, titles dissolved. The order ceased to exist on paper before it fully ceased to exist in memory. Some brothers were absorbed into other institutions. Others returned to secular life. Many simply disappeared from records. Their skills did not vanish. Their methods did not vanish. Only their name did. The collapse felt sudden to those inside it. To those outside, it felt overdue. The Knights Templar did not fall because they were uniquely corrupt or secretly powerful. They fell because they represented a form of organization that no longer fit the emerging political order. Their survival strategies had succeeded too well. As the dust settled, Europe moved on. New financial systems emerged. New bureaucracies formed. Many borrowed quietly from methods the order had refined. Few acknowledged the source. What remains unresolved is not whether the Templars were innocent or guilty by modern standards, but whether any institution built on discipline and autonomy can survive once the world around it demands control above all else. And that leaves us with a final question hanging in the quiet aftermath. When survival depends on becoming invisible, how does an institution know when it has already been seen? After the arrests, time slowed in a way the brothers had never experienced. Their lives had once been measured by bells, prayers, and schedules so fixed they became instinct. In confinement, those markers disappeared. Days blurred. Night watches came without warning. Men who had lived among others now sat alone with their thoughts, something the rule had never encouraged. The accusations moved faster than the truth ever could. They were repeated in formal language, stripped of context, shaped to fit legal needs rather than lived reality. Rituals that had once been private were described to audiences unfamiliar with symbolic practice. Silence, once a virtue, was interpreted as guilt. Obedience, once sacred, became compliance under pressure. The papacy hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than any single verdict. The church was caught between principle and survival. Defending the order openly meant confronting powerful monarchs at a moment when political balance was already fragile. Delay became a strategy. Delay allowed events to unfold without direct endorsement. Councils were convened. Testimonies were reviewed. Some confessions were withdrawn. Others were reaffirmed. Consistency was impossible because the circumstances were inconsistent. Yet the machinery of judgment continued to move, propelled by momentum rather than certainty. Outside prison walls, estates changed hands. Administrative decisions were made quietly. Grain still needed harvesting. Tenants still needed oversight. The world did not pause for justice. It rarely does. Assets were reassigned to other institutions better aligned with emerging authority structures. Continuity mattered more than origin. Former brothers who were released found themselves disoriented. They were trained for a life that no longer existed. Some joined other orders, where routines felt familiar but diminished. Others returned to families who barely recognized them. Years spent suppressing individuality left them unprepared for choice. What did not disappear were the methods. Record-keeping practices persisted. Financial instruments evolved. Networks adapted under new ownership. The systems survived because they were useful, not because anyone remembered who built them. History often preserves outcomes while erasing contributors. In later generations, stories filled the silence left behind. Some imagined hidden treasures. Others imagined secret knowledge. These narratives grew because the real ending was unsatisfying. There was no final battle, no clear moral resolution, just dissolution through administration. The truth is quieter. The Knights Templar were not destroyed in a moment of revelation. They were rendered obsolete by a world that no longer tolerated autonomous systems. Their greatest strength became their weakness. As we move toward the final stretch of this story, the lingering thought remains unresolved. When an institution's ideas survive, but its identity does not, what part of it truly died, and what part simply learned to live without a name? What followed the formal dissolution of the order was not an ending most people would recognize as one. There was no single day when the last Knight Templar ceased to exist. Instead, there was a gradual thinning, like ink fading from a manuscript left too long in sunlight. Names disappeared from rolls. Symbols were removed from doorways. Habits were replaced with simpler garments. Life moved on, but unevenly. For many former brothers, the most difficult adjustment was not loss of status or property, because they had never owned much personally. It was the loss of structure. The order had provided a framework so complete that individual decision-making had almost been unnecessary. Wake, pray, work, obey, sleep, repeat. When that framework vanished, even mundane choices became burdensome. Some men were absorbed into other religious orders, particularly those that shared similar rhythms of discipline. Yet even there, differences were felt. The Templar rule had been unusually strict in some areas and unusually pragmatic in others. Brothers accustomed to precision found themselves frustrated by looser administration. Others struggled with a renewed emphasis on contemplation rather than utility. Those who returned to secular life faced a different challenge. Years spent suppressing individuality left them ill-prepared for negotiation, inheritance disputes, or trade. Many had entered the order young, with little experience outside obedience. Now older, quieter, and less adaptable, they slipped easily into obscurity. Records rarely mention them again. The land they left behind did not fall silent. Estates reassigned to other institutions continued producing grain, wool, and rent. Tenants noticed changes in oversight. Some found the new administration harsher, others found it more corrupt. The difference was rarely ideological, it was procedural. The Templars had enforced rules consistently, their successors did not always bother. This inconsistency mattered. It altered local economies in subtle ways. Missed maintenance led to lower yields. Disputes lingered longer. Trust eroded. These effects were not dramatic enough to be remembered as consequences of the order's fall, but they were real. History often attributes decline to great causes, while ignoring the small administrative failures that follow disruption. In royal courts, the disappearance of the order solved immediate problems and created new ones. Debts were neutralized through confiscation. Authority was consolidated. But the removal of a reliable intermediary meant kings had to build systems to replace what they had destroyed. New bureaucracies emerged, often less efficient at first. Officials trained in oversight rather than service struggled to maintain the same level of predictability. Ironically, many of these new systems borrowed heavily from practices the Templars had refined. Standardized accounting, centralized record-keeping, regular audits, fixed procedures for asset transfer. The ideas survived because they worked, the name did not. This selective inheritance shaped the future of European administration. The order was remembered as controversial, but its methods were normalized. Over time, few questioned where those methods originated. They became part of the background. Within the Church, the dissolution set a precedent that lingered uneasily. It demonstrated that even a papally protected order could be sacrificed under sufficient political pressure. Future institutions took note. Autonomy became something to manage carefully rather than assert openly. Compliance, once secondary to mission, became a survival strategy. Centuries later, when historians sifted through surviving records, they encountered gaps. Entire archives were lost, repurposed, or destroyed. What remained was fragmented. This fragmentation encouraged speculation. In the absence of complete information, imagination flourished. Stories emerged of hidden wealth, secret rites, and lost knowledge. These stories persisted because they offered drama where history offered bureaucracy. The reality that an institution was dismantled through audits, accusations, and administrative decisions felt unsatisfying. Yet that reality is precisely what makes the story important. The Knights Templar illustrate how power often accumulates quietly and dissolves just as quietly. Not through rebellion, but through reclassification. Not through exposure, but through reinterpretation. They did not lose a war. They lost relevance on their own terms. Their resilience lay in their systems. Their vulnerability lay in their refusal to explain those systems to those outside them. Transparency was not part of their culture because it had never been necessary. When it became necessary, it was already too late. As Europe moved towards stronger, centralized states, institutions that operated beyond direct control were either absorbed or eliminated. The Templars were among the earliest and most visible examples. Later organizations learned from their fate, adapting more quickly, compromising more often. This raises an uncomfortable reflection. Progress in governance often comes at the cost of autonomy. Stability is traded for control, efficiency for conformity. The Templars chose stability and autonomy, assuming usefulness would protect them. History suggests otherwise. What remains today are stone buildings repurposed for other uses. Roads still follow paths they once guarded. Financial concepts echo practices they refined. Their absence is more influential than their presence ever was. And so, as this part of the story settles into silence, the unresolved thought lingers once more. When history preserves an institution's tools but erases its identity, does that represent failure or the most complete form of influence possible? What survived longest after the Order's disappearance was not memory, but habit. Long after the last official reference to the Knights Templar had faded from legal documents, people continued to behave in ways shaped by the systems the Order had once enforced. Roads were still measured by stages. Estates were still managed according to predictable cycles. Records were still kept with an expectation of permanence. The Order had vanished, but its assumptions about how the world should function remained embedded in daily life. This persistence was not deliberate. No one gathered to preserve Templar methods out of loyalty. They were preserved because replacing them was inconvenient. A farmer who knew when grain would be collected did not care who collected it, only that the schedule remained reliable. A merchant who trusted a document cared little about the name of the institution honoring it, only that it would be honored. Practical continuity outlived ideological loyalty. In many regions, the transfer of Templar property created confusion that lasted decades. Lands that had been administered by uniform rules were now governed piecemeal. Some estates passed to religious institutions with different priorities. Others were absorbed by secular authorities who lacked experience managing dispersed holdings. The transition exposed how much invisible labor had gone into maintaining stability. Tenants noticed the difference first. Under the Order, obligations had been clearly defined. Rent was due at predictable times. Disputes were handled with procedural detachment. After the transfer, expectations shifted, depending on who held authority. Some new overseers were harsher, others were inattentive. In both cases, inconsistency replaced routine. This inconsistency mattered because medieval life depended on anticipation. A missed planting window could mean hunger. A delayed repair could ruin a harvest. Stability was not an abstract ideal. It was a survival strategy. The Templars had understood this instinctively, even if they never articulated it as philosophy. Their disappearance coincided with broader changes that made such stability harder to maintain. Monarchies expanded administrative reach, but struggled to implement uniform practices quickly. Officials rotated frequently. Policies changed with political winds. What had once been managed by an institution designed for continuity was now subject to negotiation. The irony is that many rulers believed they were eliminating an obstacle to control, only to discover they had removed a buffer. The order had absorbed friction between regions, smoothing differences through standardized procedure. Without it, those differences became visible again. In some areas, resentment toward the order faded quickly. People adapted. In others, nostalgia emerged, not for the knights themselves, but for the predictability they represented. This nostalgia rarely entered written history because it lacked a voice. Peasants did not compose chronicles. Merchants rarely recorded dissatisfaction unless it affected profit. What remains are traces in court records and complaints, fragments that suggest disruption without naming its cause. Meanwhile, intellectual interest in the order declined. Theologians moved on. Chroniclers focused on newer conflicts. The Templars became a footnote rather than a focus. This absence of sustained attention allowed myths to grow unchecked later. When documentation thins, imagination fills the space. Centuries after the dissolution, storytellers return to the order not because it mattered politically, but because it was incomplete historically. Gaps invite speculation. Silence encourages invention. The contrast between the order's once visible power and its abrupt disappearance created a narrative vacuum, yet the real story resists embellishment. It is a story of procedures, not revelations, of compliance, not rebellion, of men who believed that if they followed rules faithfully, the world would respond in kind. This belief was not naive. It had worked for generations. The failure was not moral so much as structural. The order was designed for a world where authority was fragmented and trust scarce. As authority centralized and trust was enforced through law rather than reputation, the order's role became redundant. Redundancy is dangerous in political systems. What is redundant is expendable. Looking back, it is tempting to ask whether the order could have adapted. Could it have accepted royal oversight? Could it have surrendered autonomy gradually? Perhaps, but adaptation requires a willingness to redefine identity. The Knights Templar did not see themselves as negotiable. Their rules were not policies, they were vows. Institutions built on vows struggle to compromise without feeling they have ceased to exist. This rigidity gave the order strength in its early centuries and fragility later. Flexibility is a survival trait only when survival is the priority. For the Templars, fidelity came first. What remains striking is how quietly they accepted dissolution. There was no uprising, no coordinated resistance, no attempt to rally popular support. Brothers complied because compliance was all they knew. This obedience has been interpreted as guilt, resignation, or exhaustion. It may simply have been habit. Habit is powerful. It shapes response even when context changes. The order's discipline, cultivated to ensure unity, prevented improvisation at the moment it was most needed. This is not a condemnation. It is an observation shared by many institutions across history. In the centuries that followed, new organizations emerged that learned from this fate. They built flexibility into their structures. They diversified authority. They cultivated public narratives to defend legitimacy. The absence of the Templars became instructive, and yet, despite everything, their influence persisted in unexpected ways. Legal concepts of trust, financial practices based on documentation rather than presence, administrative assumptions about uniformity across distance. These were not credited to the order. They did not need to be. They had become normal. History often remembers innovators poorly because success erases novelty. Once an idea works, it stops being associated with its origin. The Knights Templar were innovators who did not seek recognition. Their reward was disappearance. As we approach the final reflections of this story, the question grows quieter but no less unsettling. When an institution succeeds so completely that its methods become invisible, does history owe it remembrance, or is invisibility the final proof of its impact? Long after the legal dissolution of the order, the physical world still bore its imprint. Stone does not forget quickly. Across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, buildings once used by the Knights Templar remained standing, repurposed, but unmistakable in form. Their architecture reflected the same mindset that had shaped their administration: practical, restrained, and designed for endurance rather than display. Templar structures were rarely ornate. Decoration was minimal. Lines were clean. Spaces were functional. Chapels were built to serve daily prayer rather than impress visitors. Storage rooms were carefully proportioned. Courtyards allowed for movement of animals and goods. These were not castles designed for spectacle. They were installations designed to operate. When these buildings passed into new hands, their design influenced how they were used. A structure built for order resists chaos. Even under different management, routines tended to form around existing layouts. Grain still flowed through storage areas efficiently. Horses were still housed where ventilation worked best. People adapted to the logic embedded in stone. This architectural persistence mirrored a broader social one. Many local communities continued operating as if the order still existed, at least for a time. Schedules remained unchanged. Obligations were fulfilled according to habit. Authority figures changed names, but expectations lagged behind reality. Change moved slower at the ground level than in royal decrees. This delay created tension. New administrators often misunderstood what they inherited. They saw assets without understanding the systems that sustained them. Estates that appeared profitable on parchment required constant attention. When that attention faltered, productivity declined. Records show increasing disputes over rents and responsibilities in former Templar lands during the decades following dissolution. These disputes were not dramatic. They involved boundary markers, missed deliveries, delayed payments, individually insignificant, collectively destabilizing. Stability is built from small consistencies. Its erosion is similarly incremental. Meanwhile, the broader world was shifting towards stronger, centralized governance. Kings expanded bureaucracies. Written law became more standardized. Officials replaced personal relationships as mechanisms of control. This transformation is often celebrated as progress, but it came with friction. Early bureaucracies lacked experience. Corruption was common, enforcement uneven. Ironically, many of the tools used to build these new systems echoed Templar practices: standard forms, central records, regular inspections. Yet without the cultural discipline that had supported them, these tools were less effective. Procedure without internalized obligation is fragile. The Church also absorbed lessons from the Order's fall. Religious institutions became more cautious about accumulating autonomy. Papal oversight tightened in some areas while decentralizing in others. The balance between obedience and independence was renegotiated repeatedly, often in response to political pressure rather than spiritual reflection. For ordinary people, these shifts were experienced not as grand transitions, but as changes in predictability. Markets became less reliable. Travel grew riskier in some regions as protective networks frayed. Trust, once anchored in institutional reputation, had to be renegotiated locally. This renegotiation took time. In the interim, uncertainty grew. People adapted by narrowing their expectations. Long-distance ventures declined temporarily. Risk aversion increased. These trends are visible in trade records and settlement patterns. Movement slowed. Investment became cautious. The disappearance of the Order also altered how authority was perceived. The Templars had represented a form of authority that was impersonal yet consistent. Their rules applied equally within the Order, regardless of background. This was unusual in a world dominated by personal hierarchy. With their removal, authority became more visibly tied to individuals again. This personalization of power had consequences. Favor mattered more. Negotiation replaced procedure. Outcomes varied, depending on relationships rather than rules. For those accustomed to predictability, this felt like regression. For those adept at influence, it was opportunity. Over generations, memories of the Order faded into abstraction. Few could recall what the Templars had actually done day to day. Their image condensed into symbols: white cloaks, red crosses, silence. These symbols detached from context, making them easy to reinterpret. As literacy expanded in later centuries, Writers encountered fragments of the Order's history without the surrounding administrative reality. They focused on trials, accusations, and abrupt endings. Drama eclipsed routine. The quiet labor that had defined most of the Order's existence was rarely mentioned because it did not translate easily into narrative. This imbalance shaped public perception. The Knights Templar became mysterious not because they were secretive, but because the most visible parts of their story were the least representative. Their beginning and end were recorded. Their middle, where they actually lived and worked, was largely ignored. Historians who later attempted to reconstruct that middle faced challenges. Records were dispersed. Some were deliberately destroyed. Others were absorbed into unrelated archives. Piecing together daily operations required patience and willingness to focus on unremarkable details. Not all scholars were inclined to do so. Those who did discovered patterns rather than revelations. They found inventories, correspondence, maintenance logs, evidence of people concerned with roof repairs, crop yields, and horse health. The cumulative effect of these records painted a picture of an institution obsessed with sustainability. Sustainability, however, is not immunity. The Order's careful balance depended on a world that tolerated semi-independent institutions. As that tolerance disappeared, sustainability became irrelevant. No amount of efficiency can protect an institution whose existence itself is politically inconvenient. This realization invites a broader reflection on historical survival. Many institutions collapse, not because they fail internally, but because external conditions render them unacceptable. Success does not guarantee protection. In some cases, it accelerates destruction. The Knights Templar reached a point where they were too useful to ignore and too autonomous to control. This is a narrow space. Few institutions occupy it for long. What makes their story enduring is not conspiracy or treasure, but structure. They remind us that history is shaped as much by accounting practices as by ideology. That human resilience often expresses itself through routine rather than heroism. That survival strategies can become vulnerabilities when environments change. As we near the final portions of this narrative, the focus shifts from what the Order was to what it represents. Not an enigma, but a pattern. Institutions arise to solve problems. They refine solutions. They persist beyond necessity. Eventually, they are replaced or removed. The unresolved thought that lingers here is simple but uncomfortable. When the systems that keep society stable become invisible, how do we recognize when removing them will cost more than we expect? The disappearance of the Knights Templar had consequences that extended far beyond immediate politics and property. The Order's influence on finance, governance, and social organization outlived its legal existence, though the people who had lived it largely vanished from memory. One of the most remarkable legacies was in the development of early financial systems. The Order had created networks capable of moving resources across vast distances without relying on local intermediaries. Merchants and pilgrims could deposit funds at one house and draw equivalent amounts at another hundreds of miles away. This early form of banking relied on meticulous record-keeping, standard procedures, and trusted seals, none of which disappeared when the Templars themselves were gone. Successors inherited the methods, even if they did not inherit the ethos. The transfer of these systems to secular and ecclesiastical hands was gradual. Local lords, recognizing their utility, adopted parts of the practice, particularly for tax collection and estate management. Religious institutions incorporated similar methods to administer their lands more efficiently. Over time, these techniques influenced emerging national administrations. The Templar approach to centralized oversight and record-keeping became embedded in the fabric of European governance, even as the name of the Order faded. Daily life, however, was disrupted. Local populations had relied on the predictability of Templar oversight for generations. Rents, harvest schedules, and even minor justice matters had been administered according to fixed rules. When the Order vanished, this predictability was suddenly absent. Estates managed by multiple hands fell into disarray. Instructions that had been uniform now became subject to interpretation. Some tenants suffered under neglectful oversight. Others encountered stricter enforcement by new rulers attempting to impose control in ways the Templars had managed more subtly. The long-term economic effects were subtle but measurable. Historians analyzing patterns of trade, settlement, and agricultural output in former Templar lands note periods of decreased efficiency and increased disputes following the order's dissolution. The Templars' rigid procedures had functioned like invisible scaffolding for local economies. Removing that scaffolding without replacing it fully caused instability. At the same time, European rulers had learned from observing the order's operations. While the Templars were inconvenient politically, they demonstrated the benefits of centralized administration and disciplined logistics. Kings who had once distrusted them later applied similar principles within their own expanding bureaucracies. Standardized records, rotational oversight, and clear chains of command became more common, often modeled in part on Templar practices. In effect, the order's methods survived even as its presence did not. Culturally, the disappearance created a vacuum that myths quickly filled. The public remembered the order for dramatic events, the arrests, the trials, the confiscation of wealth, rather than the tedious but crucial work that had defined its existence. Legends of secret treasures and hidden knowledge arose because the real story was inconveniently dull. It was about administration, discipline, and consistent action, not spectacle. This narrative imbalance explains much of the later fascination with Templars, including conspiracy theories, novels, and films. The mundane reality did not disappear. It simply became less interesting to those writing the first histories. Within the Church, the order's fall had long-lasting implications. Papal authority had protected the Templars for over a century, demonstrating the ability of the Church to create autonomous organizations. The failure to defend them fully exposed the limits of papal power in the face of centralized, secular authority. Future orders were more cautious in claiming autonomy, and oversight mechanisms became stricter. The Church's own bureaucratic evolution was influenced by this lesson. Autonomy was now a luxury to be justified continually, rather than assumed by virtue of papal decree. For former brothers, life outside the order was often difficult. Years of strict routines and suppression of personal choice left many ill-equipped to navigate secular challenges. They had been trained to follow rules without question. Now, faced with entirely new social, political, and economic landscapes, they struggled to find footing. Some assimilated into other monastic or knightly institutions. Others returned to families and lands they had left behind, finding themselves alien in familiar places. Many simply vanished from historical records. Yet while people disappeared, practices endured. Administrative consistency, attention to detail, and reliance on systematic procedures were absorbed into both secular and religious institutions. Estates continued to operate according to Templar standards for decades. Financial practices inspired by the order influenced banking in Europe. Logistics methods informed military campaigns. The order's contribution to organizational theory, though unacknowledged, persisted. The long-term social impact is equally significant. The Templars had provided a stabilizing presence in a fragmented Europe. By enforcing predictable routines and procedures, they created small zones of order in a chaotic world. Their absence forced adaptation. Communities learned to function without them, but the loss of predictable oversight temporarily increased local conflict and uncertainty. The transition illustrates how institutions often contribute more through everyday operations than through dramatic moments. At a conceptual level, the Templars' story illustrates the tension between autonomy and survival. Their strict discipline, centralized procedures, and separation from secular control had allowed them to thrive for over 2 centuries. But the same qualities that made them resilient also made them politically vulnerable. Once the surrounding environment no longer tolerated autonomous networks, the order's very strengths became liabilities. Institutions that excel in stability and internal cohesion may falter if they fail to cultivate adaptability and external alliances. Even after the order vanished, its symbolic presence endured. Templar imagery, white mantles with red crosses persisted in popular imagination. Legends of their courage, discipline, and mystery survived. Yet this symbolic persistence often obscures the true nature of their legacy. The most influential aspects, their systems, procedures, and methods, are less visible precisely because they were functional rather than theatrical. Their legacy is embedded in the practical rather than the spectacular. By the late medieval period, Templar practices had influenced broader European institutions. Military orders that emerged afterward, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, borrowed structural elements. Secular administrations adopted record-keeping methods. Early forms of banking traced operational principles back to the networks the order had built. In this way, the Templars' influence extended centuries beyond their formal existence. They reshaped how Europe managed resources, coordinated travel, and maintained continuity across vast territories. Even in literature and folklore, traces of the order's procedural precision appear, though often misunderstood as secrecy or conspiracy. Tales of hidden treasures or secret knowledge are indirect reflections of a more mundane truth. The order had created networks and protocols that allowed resources, information, and authority to move efficiently and predictably. To outsiders, these systems appeared almost magical because their inner workings were invisible. For historians, the challenge has been reconstructing the real Templar story from fragmented records. Surviving documents, charters, financial ledgers, correspondence provide detailed evidence of day-to-day operations, but few narratives of lived experience survive. The order's internal culture emphasized anonymity, compliance, and routine. Personal voices were intentionally suppressed in favor of collective identity. This makes the historian's task difficult, but also instructive. Most historical influence is invisible to contemporaries and easily overlooked later. One of the enduring lessons of the Templar experience is the subtlety of institutional power. Influence is rarely the result of force or spectacle alone. More often, it emerges from reliable, repeated action, disciplined management, and internal cohesion. The order's real power lay not in swords or fame, but in its ability to create predictability and reduce risk in an unpredictable world. Yet the Templars' fate demonstrates the limits of such power. External perception, political expediency, and changing social priorities ultimately determined their survival. Their skills, methods, and routines were not enough to protect them from shifts in authority. Even exceptional internal discipline cannot guarantee protection from external threats when the system itself becomes inconvenient to others. By the end of the medieval period, the Knights Templar existed primarily as a legend, an example, and a cautionary tale. Their tangible achievements, roads maintained, estates managed, pilgrims protected, were largely absorbed by successor institutions. Their intangible influence, discipline, organizational insight, procedural rigor persisted quietly in systems and habits. Their disappearance teaches that survival is a complex interplay between internal order and external context. Success within one framework may become irrelevance or liability in another. And so, as this section concludes, the unresolved question lingers. When the structures and methods of an institution endure long after its formal existence ends, what does it mean to truly survive? Is survival measured by name and presence, or by the persistence of influence and ideas? For the Knights Templar, the answer is both complicated and unsettling. They disappeared as a legal and social entity, but lived on invisibly in the systems, methods, and habits of the world they once disciplined. By the time the order had vanished as an institution, its methods had already seeped into the lifeblood of European society, quietly shaping governance, finance, and social organization in ways rarely credited to them. What the Templars had built over centuries was more than castles, fortifications, and battlefield accomplishments. It was a system of knowledge, a network that allowed for coordination and reliability in a fragmented world. The disappearance of the order did not erase this knowledge. Instead, it shifted, adapted, and embedded itself in new structures, creating a legacy that was invisible yet enduring. Consider the management of estates. The Templars' lands were spread across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, and they had refined methods to oversee these holdings consistently. Each estate had a carefully maintained ledger, lists of tenants, crop cycles, animal inventories, and obligations meticulously documented. The brothers assigned to these tasks were trained to note even minor discrepancies, to anticipate seasonal changes, and to enforce rules with quiet precision. The level of discipline was astonishing for the period. Errors were corrected methodically, and any deviation from established practice was reviewed. This procedural rigor allowed the order to maintain stability across hundreds of miles in a world without rapid communication. When the Templars disappeared, these methods did not vanish. Successors, whether other religious institutions or secular administrators, inherited not only the land but the systems necessary to manage it. Even if they did not fully comprehend the underlying logic, the infrastructure of order persisted. This persistence had subtle social consequences. Peasants, tenants, and laborers had grown accustomed to predictable routines. Rents collected at set times, harvests inspected systematically, disputes resolved according to documented procedure. When the order was dismantled, these routines were disrupted. New administrators, often inexperienced or motivated by short-term gain, failed to replicate the same level of consistency. Some tenants faced neglect, while others encountered harsher enforcement. Markets became less predictable. Transportation of goods was less reliable. Scholars studying economic patterns in post-Templar Europe note periods of inefficiency and increased litigation in regions formerly under the order's oversight. The Templars' quiet influence had, paradoxically, stabilized the lives of ordinary people, and its removal created friction that extended beyond the immediate political implications. In addition to land management, the Templars' early financial systems left an indelible mark. They had pioneered a method akin to modern banking, allowing pilgrims and merchants to deposit money at one house and withdraw it at another. This system relied on meticulous record-keeping, seals, and standardized documentation, creating trust in a period when theft and fraud were constant threats. The sophistication of this network was unmatched in its time. When the order was suppressed, these systems did not vanish. They were absorbed into emerging financial institutions and inspired innovations that laid the groundwork for European banking. While the Templars themselves did not benefit from this long-term evolution, their practices continued to shape economic life for generations. The consequences were not purely functional, they were cultural as well. The order's disappearance created a vacuum in the collective memory. While dramatic events, such as arrests and trials, were well documented, the daily operations that sustained stability were less recorded. This absence allowed myths and legends to flourish. Tales of hidden treasures, secret rituals, and clandestine knowledge emerged in literature and folklore, overshadowing the mundane but critical work that defined the order's existence. In essence, society remembered the Templars as mysterious and powerful, not because of evidence, but because the procedural reality was too dull to inspire narrative. This misrepresentation has persisted for centuries, fueling everything from speculative history to modern conspiracy theories. For the Church, the Templar collapse offered both a cautionary tale and a lesson in political pragmatism. Papal protection had allowed the order to operate independently for over a century, but when faced with coordinated pressure from secular rulers, the Church chose to negotiate and compromise rather than resist openly. This decision demonstrated the limits of ecclesiastical authority in a world where kings and princes were consolidating power. Subsequent religious orders adapted accordingly, structuring their autonomy within frameworks that allowed for papal oversight without provoking royal interference. In effect, the Templars' suppression shaped the governance of religious institutions for generations. Life, for the surviving brothers, was profoundly altered. Many had spent their entire adult lives within the rigid structure of the order. Their identity, shaped by discipline, obedience, and communal responsibility, was suddenly destabilized. Some sought refuge in other religious or knightly orders, finding familiar routines but diminished prestige. Others returned to civilian life, often unprepared for the social, economic, and political realities they faced. The transformation from a life of absolute structure to one requiring independent decision-making was disorienting. Many simply faded from historical records, absorbed into obscurity. Yet, even in disappearance, the Templars' methods endured in unexpected ways. Administrative routines, meticulous documentation, and standardized procedures became embedded in secular and religious institutions. Early bureaucracies borrowed heavily from the Templar model, often without acknowledgement. Military logistics, estate management, and financial coordination, all critical to governance, were informed by the systems the order had perfected. In essence, the Templars continued to shape European society not as a visible institution, but as an invisible force embedded in the way societies functioned. The disappearance of the order also highlighted the fragility of institutional power. Despite their rigor, discipline, and adaptability within their own operational sphere, the Templars were vulnerable to external forces. Their autonomy, which had been an asset for centuries, became a liability when confronted by centralized authorities that sought control over resources, finance, and influence. The order's inability or refusal to adapt politically sealed its fate. This is a recurring lesson in history. Internal efficiency does not guarantee survival when the external environment shifts. Culturally, the Templars' story became a symbol of mystery, valor, and intrigue. Legends of their secret rituals, hidden treasures, and clandestine knowledge filled the void left by the reality of administrative labor. These legends were amplified over time, becoming central to the popular imagination. Yet beneath the myths lay the truth. The order's real power derived from consistency, organization, and reliability. This mundane yet extraordinary competence allowed them to operate across continents, protect pilgrims, and manage extensive estates accomplishments that, while less exciting than treasure or swordplay, had profound historical consequences. Moreover, the suppression of the Templars set precedents for governance, both ecclesiastical and secular. It demonstrated that no institution, however powerful or protected, was immune to coordinated political pressure. Subsequent organizations were compelled to navigate a delicate balance between autonomy and compliance, learning from the fate of the Templars. In this sense, the order's influence extended far beyond its physical existence. It shaped strategies of survival, governance, and administration for future generations. From an economic perspective, the Templars' systems influenced the development of modern financial institutions. Their methods for transferring funds securely over long distances prefigured letters of credit and banking instruments used in later centuries. By providing a model of reliability and trust, the Templars laid groundwork for commercial networks that would become central to the growth of European trade. Their impact, therefore, was not confined to military or religious history. It directly contributed to economic evolution. Socially, the order's disappearance forced communities to adapt to new realities. Local populations, accustomed to predictable routines under Templar oversight, had to navigate less consistent administration. This transition period saw increases in disputes, inefficiencies, and uncertainty. Yet it also fostered resilience. Communities learned to negotiate authority, manage resources independently, and adapt to changing oversight. The Templars' prior presence had both constrained and educated these communities. Their absence accelerated the evolution of local governance. In sum, the Knights Templar exemplify the complex interplay between internal discipline and external context. Their operational success depended on consistency, obedience, and careful management. Their vulnerability emerged not from failure of these qualities, but from their misalignment with evolving political, economic, and social structures. The Order's story demonstrates that influence and survival are distinct. One can profoundly shape the world even while being physically erased from it. The Templars' legacy lies less in dramatic confrontation than in the quiet, systemic, and enduring imprint they left on society. As we reach the conclusion of this section, one must reflect. When an institution disappears in name but persists in function, when methods survive while identities vanish, how should history judge survival? Is it measured by recognition, continuity, or the invisible endurance of influence? For the Knights Templar, the answer is both unsettling and instructive. They disappeared as an organization, yet their systems, methods, and principles continued to operate, quietly shaping the trajectory of European society for centuries. As the Knights Templar faded from the formal structures of Europe, their absence began to reveal the true measure of their influence. The order had existed for over 2 centuries. Functioning as more than a military force, it was an intricate network of administration, finance, and discipline that held together parts of Europe and the Near East. Once that network was removed, historians and contemporary observers alike began to see how deeply embedded it had been in the systems of governance, social stability, and economic continuity. The Templars' disappearance was sudden, politically, but gradual in terms of societal adaptation. One of the most enduring legacies of the order was the way it influenced property management across Europe. Each Templar estate, no matter its location, was managed according to strict procedures. Every transaction, every tenant, every crop yield was recorded meticulously. They had perfected a system of accounting and oversight that allowed estates to be predictable and reliable. These methods created a network of trust. Even over long distances, a master of one house could have confidence in the condition of estates hundreds of miles away. When the order was dissolved, the land did not stop functioning. The estates themselves continued producing, but the meticulous oversight was often lost. New administrators, whether secular lords or religious institutions, lacked the same ingrained discipline and knowledge. In many cases, this led to inefficiencies, disputes, and declines in productivity. This loss of procedural knowledge had far-reaching effects. Peasants and tenants, long accustomed to predictable routines, were suddenly exposed to irregular enforcement of obligations. Rent collection, crop management, and judicial decisions became inconsistent. Markets and trade, which had relied on the predictability enforced by Templar oversight, also experienced minor disruptions. Although these changes were subtle, they were real and measurable. Scholars examining the decades following the order's dissolution note an increase in localized disputes and a decline in consistent agricultural output in areas formerly under Templar administration. The order had acted as a stabilizing force, its absence leaving a void. The Templars' pioneering role in financial systems also left a lasting imprint. Their network allowed pilgrims and merchants to deposit funds at one house and withdraw them at another, effectively an early form of banking. This required precise documentation, trusted seals, and standard procedures to maintain reliability across distances. When the order was suppressed, these financial practices did not disappear. Secular authorities and other religious institutions adopted them, often without understanding their origin. In time, these methods influenced the development of European banking systems. The Templars' innovation designed to facilitate security and trust in a fragmented world, thus survived invisibly, embedded in commercial practices for generations. Culturally, the order's dissolution created fertile ground for legend. Dramatic narratives of arrests, trials, and confiscation of wealth were widely recorded. The routine, meticulous labor that sustained the order, its real power was largely ignored. In the absence of documentation, stories of hidden treasure, secret rituals, and esoteric knowledge emerged. Over time, these legends became central to the Templars' mythos, overshadowing the mundane but historically crucial reality of their work. The Order's fame in popular imagination owes less to battlefield heroics than to its procedural efficiency and sudden disappearance, a combination that seemed mysterious and dramatic to later generations. The Church's role in the Order's fate was complex. Papal protection had allowed the Templars to operate autonomously for over a century. When political pressure from kings, especially in France, mounted, the papacy chose negotiation and compromise over confrontation. This decision demonstrated the limits of papal power and illustrated the need for future religious orders to carefully balance autonomy with political prudence. Subsequent orders adopted structures designed to ensure compliance without sacrificing operational independence. The suppression of the Templars, therefore, became a case study in institutional risk management within ecclesiastical governance. Life for surviving Templars was fraught with challenges. Many had spent decades immersed in the order's strict routines. Their identity and daily rhythms were entirely shaped by communal discipline, prayer schedules, and work assignments. When the order was dissolved, these frameworks disappeared. Some brothers sought refuge in other monastic or knightly organizations, finding familiarity but diminished status. Others returned to civilian life, confronting social and economic environments for which they had little preparation. Their training, while excellent for the operation of the order, offered minimal guidance for independent action or negotiation. Many simply disappeared from historical records, absorbed into ordinary society. Yet while the men vanished, the Templars' methods endured in both subtle and profound ways. Administrative routines, record-keeping practices, and standardized procedures were absorbed by secular governments, other religious orders, and emerging institutions. Military logistics, estate management, and financial coordination all benefited from these innovations. In essence, the order continued to shape European society quietly, its influence pervasive but invisible. The Templars' demise also underscores the fragility of institutional power in the face of changing external circumstances. Despite their internal efficiency and discipline, the order could not withstand the political maneuvering of kings seeking control over wealth and authority. Their autonomy, once a strength, became a liability. This is a recurring theme in history. The very qualities that ensure internal resilience can make institutions vulnerable when the environment changes. Internal competence does not always translate to survival. Culturally, the order became a symbol of mystery and intrigue. Stories of hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and clandestine rituals persisted because the actual operations of the order, discipline, administration, logistics were mundane and invisible. Popular fascination with the Templars is thus often a reflection of what they were not, a dramatic, secretive cabal. Their real influence was practical, systemic, and quietly transformative. The suppression of the order also served as a precedent for future governance strategies. It demonstrated that no institution, regardless of papal protection or apparent indispensability, was immune to political expedients. Subsequent organizations learned to navigate autonomy carefully, often blending compliance with strategic alliances to preserve operational integrity. In effect, the Templars' fate shaped not just the institutions that followed, but the very methods by which organizations balanced power and survival. Economically, the Templars' influence extended into the evolution of modern banking and commercial networks. By facilitating secure, reliable transfer of funds across long distances, they provided a model for letters of credit, promissory systems, and financial trust mechanisms. These practices were absorbed and refined by merchants, bankers, and other institutions, contributing directly to the rise of European commerce. The order's procedural innovations, rooted in discipline and transparency, persisted even as their formal structures were eliminated. Socially, communities were forced to adapt to the loss of predictability. Tenants, peasants, and local laborers had relied on consistent administration for survival. The disruption following the order's dissolution prompted resilience and innovation. Communities developed alternative methods for dispute resolution, resource allocation, and oversight. The order had taught stability indirectly. Its absence accelerated local social adaptation. Ultimately, the Knights Templar exemplify the complex relationship between internal discipline and external vulnerability. Their operational success derived from consistency, obedience, and administrative rigor. Their vulnerability emerged when the political, social, and economic environment shifted in ways they could not control. The Order's story demonstrates that influence and survival are distinct. One can profoundly shape the world even while being formally erased. By the late medieval period, the Templars existed primarily as legend, symbol, and cautionary tale. Their tangible achievements, roads maintained, estates managed, pilgrims protected, were largely absorbed by successors. Their intangible influence, discipline, organizational insight, procedural rigor, persisted quietly. The disappearance of the order illustrates that institutions can continue to shape society even after they have ceased to exist in formal terms. As this section concludes, one must reflect on a lingering question. When an institution vanishes physically but its methods and influence endure, what constitutes true survival? For the Knights Templar, the answer is unsettling. Their identity disappeared, but the systems, principles, and practices they developed continued to function, quietly shaping European society for generations to come.